Hello everyone, welcome to the stream. My name is Istvan. I'm a Hungarian philosopher, and in this program, I'll probably tune in about 3 times per week and read a bit of the news and just comment on what's happening. And basically, the idea behind this program is it's really rather boring unless you're interested in politics and what's happening in the world, in media, in propaganda. The idea behind this program, this broadcast, is to discuss how the picture of the world that some of the leading media outlets of different countries paint mesh together. What does this mean? It means that we are going to look at some of the news that are published in Xinhua, the Chinese state news agency, and we'll look at a variety of American media outlets. We're sometimes going to look at The Economist, sometimes New York Times, sometimes Fox, sometimes CNN, sometimes the Washington Post to get a good variety to poke around a bit. We don't always want to hear the opinion of the same side on different issues. With the Chinese, we're also sometimes going to look into some blogs which are written and translated into English by high ranking members of the Chinese military, or sometimes by politicians, sometimes by prominent professors at state universities who are allowed to communicate their message to the outside world. Some other media outlets we are going to check out are going to be some British news outlets. They are quite influential in the world, mainly because they're in English and they have a large staff, so they cover a lot of issues and topics. And some Japanese. Japan is still an important large country, especially in East Asia, where there are a lot of tensions these days. It's important to know what's going on. It's still the third largest economy of the world, and it has a large population and plays a very important role in the diplomacy of the Southeast Asian and Pacific area in general. Some other stuff that we're sometimes going to take a dive into is the politics of the EU. I myself am Hungarian. I'm from Hungary, although I used to live in the UK and in Japan and in Austria. We're sometimes going to check out some of the announcements, statistics of the EU, and sometimes some German, French, Italian news. Look at maybe what the Dutch or Swedish newspapers say. And since I'm a Hungarian, sometimes we are going to have a quick look at what's going on in Hungary. Today, we'll spend a couple of minutes on this, since one of the biggest opposition news outlets has been challenged by the government party's investors and partners. So let's start our round of news for today with what's going on Xinhua. And Xinhua, you just type in news China XINHUAENET, and you're going to get to their website. It's a .com website. It's perfectly fine to visit. You won't be probably tracked by the government or anything, at least not more than if you visit any other website anywhere on the internet. So some of the things that we find on their main lead page are farmers harvesting rice. There are always a couple of really nice, cute, positive news about the working people of China, and there are always news about what China is doing for other countries. At the moment, we see that Palestinians are facing water shortages in the Gaza Strip, and China might be able to help. President Xi stresses long-term perspective economic social planning. So if you look at this website, it's obvious that they do want to communicate to Chinese people living abroad, but also to foreigners. They do want to communicate that, things are going all right in China. Usually that's the main message. The country is stable, the country is safe, the country is becoming stronger, which is sort of true. Maybe not the stability, but the strengthening, definitely. Now, if you look at the other news which appear on the main page, one of the things is this fact check. Pompeo's fact twisting China speech versus the truth. So it's basically a direct attack on what Mike Pompeo has said about certain issues in China. Let's have a quick look at what they say about it. So they link to Pompeo's speech, and they say that U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, in his recent speech at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library, negated every aspect of China-U.S. relations, maliciously attacked the leadership of the Communist Party of China, CPC, and China's political system, and attempted to drive a wedge between the CPC and the Chinese people. He also wantonly criticized China's domestic and foreign policies, spread the so-called China threat, and called for an anti-China alliance to contain China's development. Pompeo's baseless, fact-distorting speech misrepresents history and the reality. It is full of ideological prejudice and driven by a Cold War mentality. His remarks have not only been condemned by the Chinese people, but also criticized and opposed by sensible people in the United States as well as the international community. Although there are no links on this website to any of these criticisms, I don't doubt that Pompeo's speech can be criticized for many facets, but I'm not sure they are the ones that this basically Communist Party of China edited news outlet wants to criticize. Anyway, some of the interesting things here are that this article is going to, it is very long. Uh, it takes, according to Firefox, about 2.5 hours to read through the whole article. So you can really see that whoever reacted to Pompeo's speech did take it seriously. And they go into a lot of statistics. They try to show that Pompeo was factually wrong about a lot of things, freedom of religious belief, whether the Communist Party speaks for all Chinese citizens or not, whether people have the freedom to protest. It's certain things which show that the US is not as free and not as popular as it thinks it is. It's a very interesting piece because what we see more and more in international politics is that people discover that all governments and a lot of other organizations, parts of the military, of the secret services, and even big companies, NGOs, or political organizations disguised as NGOs are trying to influence politics through the internet. And there are a lot of fake news. We all know this. This has been the rage in the last 4 or 5 years. There are a lot of companies which offer the kind of services which, for example, Cambridge Analytics offered, where they will try to help you to tailor your messages to different audiences in a way to make them very believable, no matter whether they are true or not. Now, what the Chinese are doing here, not the Chinese people, obviously, but the good people working at Xinhuanet, who are working for the government, basically. So these people are using the recently very popular format of fact-checking. These people are smart people. They're up to date. They know what's going on in international media and politics, and their English is very good. You'll be surprised if you check out this website. It's pretty fantastic, very impressive. Probably many of them are actually US educated. And what you see here is an attempt to overturn the master narrative of sort of the last 70 years that have passed since the Second World War. And the master narrative at the moment has largely been constructed by historians based in the US and the Western Europe. Obviously, since these countries were Britain, France, the US were the winners of the Second World War, and because they managed to spread English as the lingua franca. Now, what's going on here, due to these facts, is that they had a monopoly pretty much on shaping people's ideas or perceptions on what role the US is playing in politics at the international stage, what the UK's role is, and so on and so on. And China is now making a lot of efforts, going into a lot of detail to propose their own narrative, to attack different points um, of these commonplace ideas which have been spread very efficiently, which many of us take for granted without thinking too much about it. What is China replacing these ideas with? Oh, that's a good question, right? And I think there are many Chinese people who are very smart and who would give us some disinterested, very good ideas about how to fix this master narrative in a more objective way. But what we get on Xinhua.net is basically pretty much the party lines and what the current Chinese leadership is proposing as the new narrative. And just to give you a couple of snippets of what this means, it means, for example, that China is supposed to be more democratic in certain ways. Um, so that you don't have elections, that you can't vote out your leadership or hold them accountable in any other way, does not mean that you're not democratic, since you are representing the people, right? You're the voice of the demos. How could you not be democratic? Very interesting line of argument. I don't think it holds water, but you can see that this is the line that is being pushed here. Um, you get a certain idea that, for example, the US is naive because it thinks that it can influence Chinese culture. But China has a 4,000-year-old political history. It cannot be changed by a young country, by the US. Now, why is such a claim problematic? Because we know that although China has 4,000 years of political history, that history is full of fights, rebellions, power changes, different systems of governance and rule. Um, so, what that history actually shows us is that even a very long and relatively stable political unit can undergo radical changes in its political outlook and its administrative working and organizational structure. So, contrary to what this article is claiming, actually, if someone does study the Chinese political history, one will figure out that um, there might be influences coming from anywhere which might change how China operates. Maybe the saddest thing, in my opinion, about the current state of politics in China is that Chinese people have suffered a lot throughout the last, say, 200 years. And they fought really hard, a bloody and long, 30 years long civil war to get rid of the previous imperial system and to be able to decide how to go forward. But what the Communist Party has become by today is something very similar to the previous imperial system. Nevertheless, that's not in the article, of course, that's just my own 2 cents. If you read this through, you'll get a very good idea about what the idea of the Chinese Communist Party is of the master narrative. So I chose this as the first article to reflect on because what I'm trying to do on this channel is basically going to be to help people to understand a bit what's going on in the news, what the news are being used for. Now, with this piece of news, with this piece of media product content, you can see that this is a very well crafted political product, which is aimed at a broad audience. It's made really carefully to high standards. Um, there are a lot of accurate statements in it, which are peppered by a couple which are more contestable. What these kind of articles do is they try to sway people, or at least they try to undermine the persuasion of people, or they try to sort of convince people that, oh, things are not as simple as the US says. And they also do something more. They show that you don't have to choose the story which the US is offering about what's going on in the world. We have an alternative story for you, and if you work with us, if you trade more with us, if you become our military ally, if you at least don't support the US in sanctions against us or diplomatically, you can subscribe to our story, and of course, that will have its own benefits. You can portray your history in a certain way, and you can use some of the panels which we use to communicate our idea about history, to communicate ideas about your own history. And of course, people working in governments, people working around governments, around politics, they're very keen on this kind of product because everybody wants to influence the public. That's just the name of the game in many ways. Right. So much about this. I think I already blabbered on for long enough about what's happening over there at Xinhua. So let's go on to the BBC. If you open bbc.com, which is the worldwide edition of BBC, not the British edition, you will see a big picture of President Trump. Trump seeks to cast doubt on election integrity. I think this is this is a very sensitive topic at the moment in Britain because it's been pretty firmly established by now by a Westminster committee, a parliamentary committee, that there has been a lot of Russian dabbling and support for the Brexit project. So people are aware that even their own politics in Britain is they have to be more on their toes and guard the integrity of their political process against interference. Now, the worry at the moment, I think, is both for many outsiders and many people in the US that President Trump might contest the results of the election in case he loses the election. So he seems to be choosing a strategy where he tries to undermine the belief of people, at least of his own supporters, in the integrity of the electoral process. Now, obviously, if he will be elected, he will say this time things are different because he was in charge. But if he loses it, he might, not want to hand over the presidency, which would lead to a severe crisis. And right, this is indeed a big topic, and it's very good that the BBC discusses it. Let's have a look at what's going on in this article quickly. We see some photos of ecstatic Trump supporters jumping up and down in Make America Great t-shirts. And we start with a quotation from President Trump's speech. They're using COVID to defraud the American people, Mr. Trump told delegates on the first day of the party convention in North Carolina. Mr. Trump repeated his much disputed claims that mail-in ballots could lead to voter fraud. Opinion polls suggest he currently trails Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Addressing delegates in person at the party conference that has been dramatically scaled back by COVID-19, Mr. Trump accused Democrats of using COVID to steal an election. Right, so what's interesting here for me is not so much what Mr. Trump says. He says what he has been saying for the past months. His communications team is quite good and they make sure that his message is pretty coherent. Whether you like the content of that message or not, you have to give credit to his comms people. And I don't like his message, but I think the work of the people around him who work on the message is pretty good and pretty efficient. If you disagree, that just shows that you are not the target. So, what is more interesting for me here is how the BBC discusses this. And I think they start with President Trump's claims, which most European readers, including myself, would think are a bit of, how to say, what's a not too strong impression? Slightly off the rails. Maybe that's a bit strong, calling someone a bit crazy, but nevertheless, they're inaccurate. And they're inaccurate and I think debatable. And what this means is that I think the argument of the article sets things up a little bit against Mr. Trump. This might be fair. Sometimes people are wrong, and then an article showing that they're wrong is actually not a bad thing. It's what an article should do. So people who cry, "Oh, that's not unbiased," might be wrong. If someone is making false claims, and someone says you're making false claims, that person is not showing bias. That person is saying something that's accurate. So basically, what happens in the article is the BBC staff who are writing it go through some of the claims that Mr. Trump made about mail in ballots and why they're probably not correct. And then we get an analysis of the situation by their North America reporter, Anthony Zurcher. And right. So it seems that he highlights a couple of questions which people debate. Did the president mishandle the coronavirus pandemic? Is the president inflaming racial divisions in the US? And does the president lack empathy? I think these are issues that are in the center because they're very divisive for Republican voters as well. So I would say that, yeah, these are some current issues that are pretty interesting. Um, we get a little write up of what else happened on Monday night. So, some people who gave speeches, some of them very credible, some of them veteran politicians, some of them strange celebrities. Who knows who got there and how they got there and why they got invitations to give speeches. Anyway, the interesting thing here is that although the BBC tries to be fairly impartial, I think this kind of report has to be a bit broader. In general, it's good if reporting and analysis are quite narrow. But these days, we get so much narrow analysis that it's very easy to forget about the context of political questions. And by emphasizing these three issues about President Trump, whether he lacks empathy, whether he's inflaming racial divisions, racial hatred, and whether he mishandled the coronavirus pandemic, they're important questions. But there are some other important questions about President Trump's performance in general and on bigger issues. And if we stick to the questions which the Republicans um, are willing to talk about publicly, we're basically accepting their narrative, their way of thinking about what matters for or against re-electing President Trump. Is that a good thing? Not really. The Republicans are obviously going to only come forward with topics which they're comfortable talking about. So these might be really important topics, but we forget about a number of other important topics. What are these other important topics? Well, President Trump is trying to play a big role in the very tense region of East Asia and Southeast Asia. He's trying to sort of negotiate with North Korea with very little success so far to convince them to stop their nuclear weapons program. He is reshaping the relations with Australia, Japan, and South Korea, the major allies of the US in the region. And by reshaping, I mean that he's demanding more and more access to their economies, more and more benefits for American companies, and he's offering less and less in exchange in terms of military support, in terms of pushback against China. And also, he is negotiating one on one with China, leaving the key partners in the region out of the negotiations. Because of this, there are many doubts about whether he's reliable. What's the worry about this? Well, there are two worries. This might encourage China to be more aggressive with its much smaller neighbors, which might be a miscalculation, which might lead China to make missteps and, maybe run into a confrontation with one of their neighbors, which would be catastrophic for everyone. I would be very sorry for all the civilians on all sides. And it might undermine the confidence of the American allies in the region, how much they should stick to the US. Now, if people don't trust the US anymore so much, what does that mean? It means that they will naturally and necessarily have to occupy a more balanced political diplomatic position and shift a bit more towards China or seek support from Russia, tighten their relationships with India to counterbalance China's regional influence. And President Trump has not been doing well on this aspect. How about the other big topic? The other big topic, in my view, is the economy. And President Trump, so far, has made things shaky. He made things shaky in an interesting way. He is constantly threatening to withdraw from several international trade agreements with partner countries. So, people who want to invest, who want to start new companies, people who are in dynamic or riskier investments, um, a safe investment is automotive parts. A riskier one is, say, new emerging technology, green energy technology, for example, or some new trendy, interesting product in fashion or whatever. So people who would want to invest in those are less likely to invest. Basically, he's slowing down investment. He's slowing down progress. And he is making it less likely that banks and other investors will lend money to people because the environment is less safe and secure. So people who don't have already a big capital are unlikely to be able to start businesses in this environment. President Trump claims that he was very successful because the stocks are up. What does that show? It shows that people are looking for safe havens because people are not investing the money in anything new. They are looking for bonds, stocks, federal papers, the safe companies, where even if something big happens, your money will get you good dividend like Microsoft, IBM, Coca-Cola, some big banks, and so on and so on and so on. So actually, what he claims as a good result shows that the economy is not developing in the right direction. But this is not discussed in this BBC piece, and I think that's a sad concession to letting the Republicans set the agenda about how we judge President Trump and how we understand what is going to happen to him and what should happen to him in the future. Well, let's next have a look at Japan today. Japan today is maybe one of the more center, a little bit conservative newspapers. It's fairly balanced usually, and like the Japan Times, is not that biased towards the U.S. and against the Japanese government, or at least the ruling conservative party. The Japan Today offers usually a sensible but sometimes very superficial commentary on things. Now, it's an interesting setup. If you go to their webpage, you see a beautiful big picture, if I'm correct, about the Kiyomizu-dera, which is a huge, very famous, beautiful temple in Kyoto. Usually it's full of people, um, but this time it's strikingly empty in this photo. Um, so, what does this tell us? It shows us that there are big problems with tourism. Tourism has been a booming, upcoming industry in Japan in the last 5 years. The number of tourists who come to Japan annually has, I think, become 10 times of what it was around 2012, 13. And Japan has been doing very well. Now, if you come to Japan, it's very easy to get around. There are English language signs, there are Chinese, Korean, even in many places, Russian or German signs. You get, there are a lot of guides. Most people speak a bit of basic English, so it's easy to get around. They're doing a really good job. Their hospitality is fantastic. But of course, they're not allowing many people into the country at the moment. So the whole restaurant and tourism industry is suffering. The government came up with a scheme where they are giving Japanese people huge, up to 30% discounts if they travel within the country. The interesting thing about this is the government rolled out this scheme. They're pushing it all the time, but the countrywide association, medical association, I think, cautioned people against using it and told people, no, just stay at home, don't travel. In many prefectures, Japan is organized into prefectures, not states or counties. Many prefecture leaders said the same. They agreed with the medical association against the government. Still, 2 million people used the program in a country of 132 million people. That's not too much because in the last weeks, Japan had the biggest national holiday. It's called Obon. It's basically sort of a week when people remember those who died in their family, their ancestors, and pay respect to them. And everyone gets a couple of days off at work, and everybody's traveling normally. Now, that only 2 million people used the subsidy campaign, the subsidy that this campaign offered, that is, I think, a quite low number. So this is what the picture puts into focus without much commentary. You just have to click on the picture to get to know what they think about it, which we won't do because it's an interesting issue, but it's what happens everywhere. But what do we see as the latest news next to this? On the top, China, US hold trade talks, agree to push forward phase one deal. The interesting thing here is that this is the most important for Japan. I think that's natural, given that Japan is sort of a small country despite the size of its economy. Its population is much smaller than the US's or China's, and its economy is much smaller than that of those two giants. Its military is much, much smaller, so it's wedged in. Russia is another neighbor. This is very tense and interesting for Japan. And as far as I understand, Japanese leaders are quite upset that the US isn't really keeping them up to date about what they're doing. They haven't been complaining about this very vocally, or at least I haven't seen a lot of complaining about this in English and at the conferences where I go. But I do know that many foreign commentators and experts have noted that this is risky. The current US government and administration might sell out some of the regional allies if they get a good enough deal from China. So this is very tricky. So the U.S. is basically trying at the moment to push back against China's very aggressive economic and military policy in the region. That's what the context is to the whole debate, Pompeo's speech, and the Shinho reply to that. You have to know that. That's the background. So yeah, this is a quite factual and lightweight report on what happened here. As usual, the Japan Today isn't offering a lot of commentary, um, and it contextualizes what's going on. It mentions the TikTok debate, it mentions the Hong Kong events, and it mentions the some of the back and forth between Chinese and US officials, but it doesn't do too much. Um, right. So the comment section is always priceless. Some of the most extreme and strange comments pop up here. Anyway, I encourage you to sometimes have a look. It's nice to see how what China and the US are doing matters to the smaller countries in the region. I mean, Japan is not small in economic terms by any means, but if you look at its power compared to China or the US, it's obviously a middle power, not a superpower. And they have their own distinctive perspective because of their location and their very specific relation with China and the US. So sometimes you learn something interesting. And to be honest, the general drift of this article seems to be that, this back and forth between the two countries is very rhetorical. They're always talking, oh, we made progress, and then there's a pushback. We made progress, then there's a pushback. Um, there doesn't really seem to be any real information coming out either from the Chinese or the American party about what is actually happening. I think the commentary is a bit sparse, and that's what it communicates, that these are not very transparent negotiations. What do we get from the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, one of the bigger German newspapers? Well, they also topped the page with Trump, and they put most things about Trump in the context of the coronavirus vaccine. So they are trying to evaluate how Trump tries to push for a fast vaccine and what this means for his politics, whether that's possible or not. Um, Below that, we get some ideas about debates in German politics, which are of course quite important. Germany is the biggest economy in Europe. They are the country which sends the most representatives to the EU, and they are one of the leading technological powers of the world, one of the leading military powers of the region. So, what's happening in their internal national level politics is very meaningful for the whole region and through that to the world, since the EU is still quite a weighty political economic entity. But the main thing we gather from the opening page of the FAZ, is that most news are about the coronavirus and its different kinds of effects on the economy, on people. Um, there are some interesting economic news, but they're also contextualized in this and by this topic. So, if we have a very quick look at Auslandpolitik, which is foreign politics, what do we get? Well, rise. Um, Re-election in Israel is delayed. That's interesting. You have to know that the FAZ is a quite what you would call in US politics liberal leaning newspaper. So they um, are quite critical with the current Israeli government. On some issues, I think rightly so. On some issues, I'm not sure. I'm not well informed enough to comment on everything. But yeah, there is engagement with these kind of issues. Right, so that's what you get. This seems to be what at the moment concerns the Germans. And of course, there's a lot on the GOP. There's a lot on the ongoing protests in the US. And there are some things on what's happening in Africa, the power transition in Mali, and what's happening in Russia and Belarus at the moment. I really like the engagement with African politics. It's strange that we don't see that in the major US outlets. They're very inward focused. I think that's a sad side effect of the current government's policies of putting the US first, but that makes people a bit myopic and loses sight of many important political issues that the US has a big effect on. And what I want to conclude on, what I want to finish with, is by taking a very quick look at a website called index.hu. So, Index, until a little while ago, used to be the major opposition newspaper in Hungary. They are an electric only online only outlet. Their readership is quite sizable. Hungary only has about 9.5 million people. That's the whole population. It's a tiny country. And Index usually reach several hundred thousand people or up to a million, 2 million people per day. And they were very critical with every government. So they have been in opposition very, very firmly since their inception. And they publish a lot on corruption cases. They publish a lot on um, statements of politicians which are further away from the truth than falsity. And recently, not so recently actually, but a while ago, a businessman acquired the group of products to which Index belongs, who belongs to um, the business circles supporting the current government. And everyone had the worry that there is going to be a change to the editorial team. This change, I think, happened 2 years after they acquired the magazine. They took it slowly and gradually, but now they basically nominated a man for um, chief editor who has been known to be very servile in all his jobs. He's not really a typical outspoken soldier of the government party, but he is just the kind of guy who does the job you send him in to do. And if the job is to water up things, he's going to do the job. And I'm checking out their main page at the moment. The interesting thing is that up until now, Most of the leading news were news which told you about what the government is up to, what are news from within Hungary, and if there has been something naughty going on, then that was really well covered. Now, today, if I open this web page, what do I see? I see some news about right, German doctors confirming that Alexei Navalny, who is one of the most prominent Russian opposition politician, has really been poisoned. That's an interesting international news. A shocking gang rape in Israel. I That's a very sad piece of news. It's important to talk about these issues, but why that is on top, I think it shows that we're already going in a direction where we're trying to get these kind of sad or outrageous, emotionally moving, tragic news from other countries, which sort of tune people into that mindset that, oh, we're saved, the government takes good care of us, it didn't happen in our country. Um, what else is going on? Um, we get a tiny letters that in Belarus the army is in ready to intervene on the side of President Lukashenko. That's a sad thing. And then further down we get some small news about domestic politics, but they're about the trains being late, the weather changing. There is one news item that one government politician attacked another government politician. They criticized each other very heavily. Sadly, the rest is not very engaged. What if we check the domestic politics section? If we check the domestic politics section, we find that there are some news about underage criminals who beat up a policeman. That's the lead news. So it doesn't engage with politics at all. Then we get, we get some Corona news. We get some trains being late. If you bought muesli, don't eat it at a certain shop because it might be salmonella infected. Nothing, no commentary on what the opposition parties or what the government is doing. Very little. So I think what we see is that the new chief editor is already pushing things into a much more neutral, much more watered up direction. And sadly, Hungary lost is lost its most prominent um, and intelligent government critical outlet. I'll say goodbye on that note. Thank you for bearing with me if you've been watching. And I'll be here on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, reading the news, discussing what's going on in the world, and discussing how the newspapers and the online outlets and the governments that might influence them or the businesses that might influence them want us to think about politics, what their communicational means are, what kind of stories they're trying to construct to convince us that their story is true. Thank you so much for your attention and join me again on Wednesday around the same time. Goodbye, everyone.